Okay, this is the second half of the politics lecture, and it's the first part of the second half. I'm not sure exactly how many parts we'll have. In this section, we'll talk about chiefdoms. And before we move to that, I want to point out that we've now moved into what I'm calling complex societies, and I'm juxtaposing that against acephalous societies, which is what we talked about in the previous two sections when we talked about bands and tribes. Bands and tribes both fall into the category of acephalous because they do not have formal centralized leadership. In complex societies, you do have formal centralized leadership. And here's the definition of a chiefdom. It is a regional polity in which two or more groups are organized under a single chief who is at the center of a ranked hierarchy of people. Right. A regional polity just refers to a political organization that controls a region, a geographical area. And two or more groups organized under a single chief. The chief, as I said, has formalized authority and can tell people what to do. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. The two or more groups are generally organized by kinship. Right, so usually you have multiple clans in which there are multiple lineages of people who are seen to be related to one another, biologically related to one another. In our next section, we're going to talk about kinship. I think that's the next lesson coming up. So we'll get into the details of that some more then. For now, we just need to know there are large family groups. Ranked hierarchy. Still, there generally is a ranking system. If you recall, a ranking system is an ascribed status, an achieved status that is based on prestige alone, not power or wealth necessarily. So an achieved status, meaning that it can change during your lifetime, and it's based on prestige, which is the respect given to an individual by his or her peers. So generally they still have a ranking system, even though they have formal authority. Off to the left we have examples of two different chiefs from the same group. It's the Kwakiutl. You may recall that we talked briefly about the Kwakiutl in the economics lecture when we talked about the potlatch. Excuse me, the same group of people in the Pacific Northwest in North America. And that was organized from colonial times, so pre-colonial times, as a chiefdom. And you can see that they are still in existence. And they have a specialized status under the current governments. So they're existing within modern states, and it's relatively common that chiefdoms did survive into modern states. They could find some place to fit in. Part of the reason for that is because they had centralized authority. Right? If settlers came from Europe or any other place in the world, and they encountered people who were organized differently, were not organized in a state, they often went looking for their leader, and if you went to a band and you asked for the leader, you probably weren't going to find a leader. They had a headman. They didn't have anybody that could tell anybody what to do. They didn't have any kind of centralized authority. Headman was just somebody that people looked up to. They may have pointed to the headman. They may not have. They may have said nobody's in charge, and that would have been very strange if somebody was coming from a state to encounter that. If they encountered a chiefdom, then they asked who's in charge, and they were led to a chief. Europeans particularly came from a system with monarchies, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get to the states. So they were a more complex form of political organization. But the monarchic system has one person in charge, very much like a chief, and so they could make a direct analogy between the kings and queens and emperors in Western Europe and the chiefs that they encountered among more complex indigenous people wherever they went exploring. So if they got led to a chief, they regarded the chief largely as a king, and so they knew how to deal with the king. And as we'll see as we go through this, the two systems are not structurally that different. Monarchy works very much like a chiefdom. It's just that it's expanded into the machinery of a modern state as well. A couple of consistencies I can point out in the pictures to the left. You got a historical Kwakiutl chief that's actually a woodcut, I believe, and you can see that he's wearing he's got some sort of headgear on there, and the artistic style matches the pole that the chief up top is carrying. Not an exact match, but it's the same style, so you can see that there's cultural consistency there in terms of the the things that indicate his status. He's got some kind of a robe on. There's some kind of a robe on the guy on the top too. I think that picture was taken in the 80s or 90s, the top picture. So you can see he's still got some of the trappings of traditional chief status. right, in his group. But he's also got the symbols of status in the Western system, of which he's now a part. He's wearing a suit and tie as well. So that's good evidence. Well, it's not great evidence, but it's an example of a chiefdom that survived into modern times and was able to coexist within a state. Move to the next. Social structure and chiefdoms. As we mentioned at the start of this, in the unilinear evolutionary model that Elman Service laid out, excuse me, there was seen as a regular progression from least complex to most complex in accordance with the size of the group. So as we get more complex, well, I should reverse that actually. As we get more people, we get more complexity. So these are larger groups than we see in tribes. If a tribe gets to be a certain size, say you have a tribal group that is based on a horticultural system, and that horticultural system becomes more and more efficient until it becomes an agricultural system, and they can produce a large surplus and get a larger population, probably there is going to be a marked shift from a tribal organization into a chiefdom. That's the most likely scenario. They may go directly to a state. It's not always necessarily a clear, a regular progression. So we have thousands of people. Usually once we get around 10,000 people, we're starting to move into state territory. Right, so we may have several thousand people in a chiefdom structure. This is too many people for everyone to know everybody individually. So you know the people in your clan group, you know the people in the competitive clan groups. They have the incest avoidance. They have an incest taboo, obviously. They do practice a sort of exogamy in relation to their own family groups, so they'd know other clan groups from that. They'd marry into them and have all kinds of interaction with the other clan groups. On the other hand, they don't, strictly speaking, have to have a practice of exogamy because they have a large enough population. They don't have to send people outside of their actual chiefdom necessarily to get married. They could even have a preference for endogamy within the chiefdom, but exogamy where the clan is concerned. Okay. So not everybody is related, at least in a way that they're aware of. Probably everybody's related if you go back far enough, but that's true everywhere if you go back far enough. There still is a common ethnicity. We don't see multiple ethnicities within one sort of political organization until we get to the state. And then we see the pluralistic state as opposed to the nation state, and we'll get into that when we get to states. But so far, in bands, tribes, and chiefdoms, people stay within their ethnic groups pretty much. They're aware of other ethnic groups, but they're not part of the same political structure. Still true of chiefdoms. Stratification, there's, as we said, a ranked social structure, and I already explained that. That's an achieved status, can change during your lifetime, and based on prestige, more than power or wealth, although power and wealth begin to come along with it as the economy matures. That is, as people are producing more of a surplus, more of that tends to accumulate with the people who have high status. There is emergent slavery. We do see incidents of slavery, and a lot of times when we talk about slavery in Western classrooms, it automatically dredges up the slavery that happened in the United States, which was an example of slavery, but it was not an isolated example by any means. In fact, if you look at the development of early states, there's almost always slavery in association with early states. I say emergent in this case because they may or may not have the underlying preconditions that allow for slavery. For example, if we have, look at the acephalous societies, bands and tribes. They can't really make you a slave because they don't have specialized labor. If you don't have specialized labor and you take a captive in warfare, say, which is where most slaves came from initially, or at least a large part of them, they certainly had wars and bands and tribes, but if they captured somebody, rather than just killing them, then brought them back to their village, then they would just be doing everything that everybody else did to survive, right? Because everybody was doing subsistence labor in the first place. Men were mostly hunting, women were mostly gathering, all the other things they were doing, everybody had to do. So basically, if you captured somebody, brought them into your group, there's no hierarchy differential in order to make that person have a different status than anybody else in the group. So in bands and tribes, you really don't see slavery. You also don't see people taking captives in warfare. When they have warfare, they go to kill people, and they kill people and go home. They don't bring anybody back with them. When we get to chiefdoms, depending on their form of subsistence, right? If they're they have to be at least. I suppose you can have some. There's some examples of chiefdoms that are organized as pastoralists. Pastoralists can produce a relatively large surplus, but most of them are horticulturalists, so they have a mixture of animal husbandry and plant domestication, and they're moving into agriculture. They may be agricultural societies, just small scale. Excuse me. In those cases, they may be producing enough of a surplus to have specialized labor. We know that they have specialized labor because they have this figure of the chief, whose job is to rule things. Chief doesn't have to do day-to-day subsistence work. So at the very least, they have the concept of specialized labor. Depending on the status of the economy, they may have more specialized jobs. So some people can be freed up for government and other purposes, and other people can be made to do the basic subsistence labor. So in chiefdoms, you may see people taking captives, or otherwise people who are in poor standing in the community becoming slaves. Look for that in the Ainu reading. The Ainu is a really strange case. No, not really strange. If you start looking at the record, there are a lot of exceptions to the models that I'm presenting. Among the Ainu, they were a chiefdom. You should have been tipped off on that, because they spent about 2-3 pages talking about the chief and how the chief is chosen. So that's a good example of that, and that's why I chose the chapter. They talk about the politics of the group. It's a strange group because they're not using an advanced form of subsistence. Right? They are hunting and gathering still. And how do they get away with that? Well, technically, hunting and gathering is based on wild foods rather than domesticated foods. They're primarily making a living by fishing. They're on an island in a peninsula, depending on which group you look at, and so there are a lot of fish in the ocean. And people who are hunting and gathering technically can catch enough wild fish to support a large population. In fact, a lot of the fish that we eat today in our Western society, where we're heavily dependent on intensive agriculture, is still wild caught. Right? The oceans are enormous, and so they have a lot of resources. People learn to fish and exploit those resources really well. They can support a larger population, which is why the Ainu, even though they're using a relatively simple subsistence method, because they're relying on fishing, they can support a larger population, which necessitates a more complex social structure. All right. So yeah, look for evidence of the things that we're talking about in the Ainu reading. Next slide. Economy and chiefdoms. Subsistence strategy. As we said, we already kind of talked about this. They're in transition to intensive agriculture. Usually once they have a fully fledged agricultural system, they will develop into a state relatively quickly. Meaning several generations rather than several thousand years, right? Specialized labor, we already talked about that too. I'll redefine it for you. That's any labor that's not directly connected to subsistence, and so that doesn't exist again in bands and tribes. It does exist in chiefdoms, though. And as we said, the chief is the primary example of that. But there may be other people who do things other than subsistence labor. Distribution. You may see certainly all sorts of reciprocity that were practiced in any of the other groups that we talked about are practiced in chiefdoms. So generalized reciprocity, negative reciprocity, and balanced reciprocity are all part of chiefdoms, much as they're part of modern states. They often have tribute systems, which is a form of redistribution, which we talked about in the economics lecture. And it was the one where you pay in trade rather than pay in money. A taxation system is a form of redistribution in which you pay with using a monetary system. Right, you pay with money. I noted tribute systems here because it's most likely connected with chiefdoms, because often they haven't developed monetary systems yet, or they're still even in horticultural systems, and so they may not be able to have a full taxation system. So often we see tribute systems in association with chiefdoms. I'm not saying that they can't have a monetary system. You may find chiefdoms where they do, and in those systems they may have a system of taxation rather than tribute, but they're both redistribution. Goods or money are paid into a centralized location in the form of the chief in this case, and then it's redistributed. If they didn't have the role of the chief to redistribute things, then they couldn't have redistribution. So, bottom line, they have the capacity for redistribution. Usually it takes the form of a tribute system. Occasionally you'll see they have a monetary system and taxation. Right. Material culture, obviously, everything that is associated with the transition to intensive agriculture is associated with chiefdoms. Right. They have built permanent structures, towns, villages, towns, cities. Public works. I'm not sure if we talked about public works. We should have when we talked about agriculture and in the subsistence section. Public works are anything, excuse me, any project that requires the group to mobilize a lot of labor for something that's going to benefit the entire group. That's a public work. Examples of public works in these cases may include temples, roads, irrigation systems, things like that. If you go to any town in a Western country in the United States, in any state in the United States, we have a Department of Public Works, and what they do is they maintain those structures that everybody uses. And those are the ones that are controlled by state governments. We also have public works like churches, which are not controlled by the state government, but it still is considered a public work. So monuments and things that are built for a broader use. And you have to mobilize a lot of labor in order to do it. You don't have public works in bands and tribes as a rule because you can't mobilize the labor. Right? There's no the social structure and political structure are not sufficient to be able to mobilize that labor for the public good. So we do see that in chiefdoms. Government and chiefdoms. We see, we already touched on this. Government is a centralized hereditary authority invested in the personage of the chief. Right? So the chief can ultimately make decisions. They can tell people what to do. They can mediate in disputes. They can act like a judge in those disputes. Still, they judge cases based on the individual circumstances involved. Still, they have to be aware of the politics. If you think about the nature of the power of the chief, it still is a ranking system. It still is based on prestige. The chief can lose power or lose influence. Chief is usually the head of a large lineage, right? And the status of other lineages are often determined in their degree of relatedness to the chief, right? So if the chief's lineage is strong, the chief can get away with a lot. Nobody can really challenge the chief because there is an underlying threat of physical violence, and that's what this devolves into if there are serious conflicts that can't be resolved. If somebody questions the right of the chief, then there could be what's called a clan war. We have different clans that are fighting against each other. These groups, large groups of different lineages that are related to each other. They will actually come into physical contact and conflict. And generally, the way that sorts out is the larger clan with the most adult men usually wins. I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule, but by and large, if you're the population within your lineage and your clan group is getting bigger, you get stronger. If it's getting smaller, you're getting weaker, right? So the chief has to be relatively careful. They don't want to make their own kinspeople angry, right? If they do that, then they lose support from them, and then it's a wild card. You don't know what's going to happen. They may side with another group if they really don't like you. If the chief has a smaller family and they make other larger, more powerful groups angry, then they could end up just being deposed. And what that means in this case is, well, they get killed. And probably a lot of their family members get killed too, and just to make sure that they don't make any more claims to the chiefdom. Right? So they can make decisions, they can tell people what to do, but within reason. There still are constraints on the power of the chief, and the chief's very much aware of that. Chief gets his power, by the way. Let's see if I have this in the next one. Yeah, we can talk about it on this page. The chief gets his power, by the way, generally from a perceived connection to a divine ancestor. Right, so the chief will claim descent from a god, more or less. This is a system, again, that was familiar to Western Europeans when they turned up, because there's a concept in Western Europe, in the history of Western Europe, if anybody ever took Western Civ, they know this, of divine right of kings. And we don't have, in Western Christianity, which is the divine right I'm talking about, they didn't have the idea that you could be descended from God. That was a blasphemy within the Christian religion for hundreds of years. In other systems, they don't have any such prohibition. Right. So in Western systems, the divine right meant that you were anointed by God. God chose the king, and that's why the king has power, and that's used to justify the power of kings, not just in the West, but all over the world. When you look at the Japanese system, the emperor is seen to be a living god, actually. So this is a fairly common idea across cultures. It's a good way of solidifying your power. People look at somebody that's in charge and they say, well, what right do they have in charge? Well, they're descended from a god, or they are a god, or they need some kind of a justification. In any case, Westerners that encountered chiefdoms, they could relate to that because they had the concept of divine right of kings, and so the chief that they ran into would start talking about his lineage and explain that he was descended from this god and that god, and they understood the concept at least, even if they didn't believe in the gods. So chiefs tended to get a fair amount of respect from Western encroachers. So if there were, again, it's a ranking system. On the other hand, power and wealth tend to accrue to people who have prestige in this system. So the chief tends to have access to things that other people don't. Often they have a practice of polygyny in these groups, P-O-L-Y-G-Y-N-Y. We'll talk more about those distinctions when we get to the family section in a couple of lectures down the road. So if polygyny is allowed, which it is in a lot of these cases, the chief will likely have multiple wives and multiple households. Generally it is a male figure, not always, but generally. If there are slaves or servants, if there is specialized labor beyond the chief himself, and they do have slavery as an institution, then those slaves, if there are a few of them, are going to end up working directly for the chief, probably. If there are a lot of them, they may be spread throughout the community. If there are specialized material goods, then the chief will likely have access to them. And to the left we have a picture of a Hawaiian chief, and I use the term anglicized. That just means they've taken on English characteristics. And I chose that because, well, he's wearing a tuxedo, and that's not native Hawaiian dress. There still is some semblance of this group, this chiefdom on Hawaii. As I said, chiefdoms often survived much better than the other groups who didn't have formalized leadership in the face of Western encroachment. So this guy maintained his position and absorbed some of the Western habits, as did the Kwakiutl chief that we saw earlier on. Okay, that's it for chiefdoms. If I have another video, if I can post it, I will. It's just a separate video on chiefdoms, and the next section will be on the state.